and we're going to have a chat with Paul Aspinall, who is the hydrogen lead at consultant Arcadis. Now, Paul is going to have a look at the carbon issue at a more granular level, that is, looking at the construction site. Now, Paul says that constructing net zero infrastructure using construction methods and carbon-emitting diesel plant is just like recharging an electric vehicle from a diesel generator. Okay, Paul, come and tell us more. Paul, thank you.
Morning, everyone. I'm Paul Aspinall. I'm Project Director and Hydrogen Lead at Arcadis, and very pleased to be talking to you today about decarbonising construction plant and how we can hopefully remove diesel and fossil fuels from our construction sites. And as part of our hydrogen community in Arcadis, we are committed to developing these decarbonised solutions around the globe with our vision to support the simultaneous growth of supply and demand for hydrogen across our industries. And that's across the hydrogen value chain for generation, storage, distribution and end-use solutions across all sectors. And we're working with the likes of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development to accelerate the deployment of these into our industries. So you may be familiar with some of the common terms that we're discussing and being in the press. So I'm just going to recap briefly on some of these. So you're probably familiar with grey hydrogen. Grey hydrogen is where predominantly the most of our hydrogen that we obtain, and that comes from fossil fuels. It's from the steam reformation process, from gas methane. So currently we're obtaining hydrogen from fossil fuels. Now blue hydrogen is exactly the same as grey hydrogen. We just capture the carbon emissions in carbon capture facilities. Now, and there is very little, if no blue hydrogen available at this moment in time. And you're probably very familiar with green hydrogen. And green hydrogen is produced from a process called electrolysis. And if the electricity for that process is obtained from renewable sources, it can be classed as green hydrogen. And that's clearly more where we want to be. But there are other fuels and sources that we must be aware of, and we must be fuel agnostic to this process and apply the right technology for the right application for the right solution. So we have ammonia, which is an effective carrier of hydrogen as NH3, and we have sustainable fuels. And of course, where we can electrify, and it makes sense to do so, we should absolutely electrify. Now, you might be familiar with some of the hydrogen rainbow, but we're trying to move away from the hydrogen rainbow and define these more as part of the carbon intensity of the hydrogen, of how it's been derived, how it's been generated. And these are the definitions that have been created by and been published by the Hydrogen Council. And for reduced carbon, for low carbon and ultra low carbon carbon intensities. Hydrogen for carbon intensities. But of course the UK's developed completely different metrics for the rest of the world. So how do we develop a consistent and robust and a message to the population and say, well, what is the right type of hydrogen? How should we get there? So there's some work being done now to try and create this in our familiar A to G labelling system to make that message more consistent. And who's to say pink or green hydrogen, which is better, and how can we define that? And that should be the message that should be developed going forward. Now, we've been talking about delivering sustainable buildings and sustainable projects for years. We've developed BREEAM outstanding buildings, fantastic. But it is completely illogical that we continue to use fossil fuels to develop these. So what are we going to do about that? How can we remove diesel from them? And how can we rapidly accelerate deployment of these decarbonised solutions on our construction sites? Now, of course, we've had the government's 10-point plan, and that's now been doubled in efforts to 10 gigawatts of production by 2030. And Jane Toogood's been appointed as the UK Hydrogen Champion, and she published her first report last month, noting, of course, the use of hydrogen on construction sites. And we've got Europe who've effectively quadrupled their ambitions for hydrogen production by 2030 to 10 million tonnes per year. So what can we do in construction, and why does it matter? Well, in 2020, the construction industry produced approximately 11.4 million tonnes of carbon emissions, and that was a dip, no doubt, due to COVID. And of that, 2.4 million tonnes of carbon was due to, which represents 17% of the emissions from the industry, due to effectively diesel. Now, in April 22, red diesel was the entitlement to that was withdrawn by the government, effectively tripling the cost of the use of diesel on construction sites, and therefore the cost of all the operations on construction sites. And we have our clients who've mandated these net zero targets, some of which are only 7 years away, so by 2030. So how can we do that? So we'll take a brief look at Lower Thames Crossing, a case study for the aspirations of that major project and to achieve net zero. And the project used carbon assessment tools to assess how much carbon was going to be generated across the project, and looked at suitable procurement solutions to encourage that decarbonisation. There was the necessary legislation and updates required to tackle this, and there are other challenges to overcome and questions to be answered. But there is a plan there to help decarbonise. Now, even after all the best practice solutions, there was 1.76 megatons of CO2 to be removed from the project, of which 16% of that project accounted for diesel use on site. And half of that diesel, that 16%, was attributed to just 4 pieces of plant. So that was a significant challenge to remove just that diesel from the project. So we just take a look at one of those. And this is just to deliver the concrete to site, not the embedded carbon of the concrete, but just to deliver the concrete to site would use over 5 million litres of diesel. That creates up to over 15,000 tonnes of CO2. And so we were investigating alternative solutions for that. Now, this is not a box-ticking exercise. Now, a client actually sent me this picture to articulate the precise brand embarrassment they wanted to avoid. And somebody on LTC said to me, I found a fantastic electric piling rig to use, but there's no infrastructure. By definition, a lot of construction sites don't have infrastructure to connect to. So the proposal was to use a diesel generator to operate that piling rig. And this is the precise behavioural change we need to move away from to embrace the new technology and develop decarbonised solutions. Business as usual solutions that can proactively implement and not to the detriment of delivering the project. So what are these practical decarbonised solutions? We've got the OEMs bringing new technology to market. These are new and fantastic, obviously expensive at this moment in time as the new technology is brought to market, but the price will rapidly decrease as we've seen from other passenger vehicles and EV vehicles come to market. We have other solutions, other fuel cell solutions, also hydrogen combustion engines that are being developed by global manufacturers, and the opportunity to retrofit for accelerated deployment. We also have fuel cell generators that can help facilitate that the recharging of electric plant on site. Now, one of the key challenges here is the logistics around this. We've been taken for granted for years for the construction industry to obtain the diesel, distribute the diesel, and refuel our plant. How can we support the construction industry to make this change? So to obtain the hydrogen, the right type of hydrogen, if we're talking about decarbonising, what type of hydrogen do we want to implement on site? How do we distribute that? How do we store it? And ultimately, how do we refuel that? And these new refuels will require new infrastructure requirements. And this is for both battery and hydrogen solutions. And we've got new technology being rolled out, new hydrogen bowsers, and the new technology is actually on display over the road in the hall today. But we've got to be mindful about this new technology and how we integrate that with the solutions being developed. How do we implement the cascaded or compressed solutions at what pressures for the right equipment? So this is not, this is a considered piece of equipment that needs to be rolled out for these logistics. So in summary, we do need to remove diesel and other fossil fuels from construction sites, and it does no longer make sense to continue to deliver sustainable buildings using these fossil fuel methods. But we need to be supporting our supply chain to succeed in adapting to these changes and set up the projects for successful decarbonisation. But we must use the right technology, the right fuel for the right application, and support and have the solutions for simultaneous supply and demand. It's not all well having the end use equipment, but unless we have the logistics and the solutions in place for that supply chain, it won't be able to be implemented suitably. And we can use our major projects as an enabler, but we do need to set up the behavioural and change and mindset for implementing for all projects across the construction industry. And with the size of the construction industry and all the projects that we have out there, all the diesel that are being used on our construction sites, just imagine the size of that prize for decarbonisation. Thanks very much.
Now, Martin says there's a lot of good talk experience and common sense, even some new tools that have been around for a long time. What is the problem with just getting on with it?
I totally agree. I think that is the challenge now, and especially with the challenges and timescales, we have to get on with it. And I think funding is clearly an issue. There's funding schemes available. The government are encouraging some of that funding, and there have been a lot of funding schemes that have come over the last few months. But I think there are so many ties with that. We need to make sure that funding opportunity is being delivered to showcase and rapidly accelerate deployment.
Hashtag interchange. Let's see if we can get another question in. I mean, I will ask whether the solution is hydrogen or electric. There is a lot of generation and transmission infrastructure that's needed to support low carbon fuels on construction sites. Is that going to slow down adoption?
Transmission of hydrogen?
Yes.
I think it's certainly a consideration. How do we develop these solutions at scale? And how do we, is the UK going to be a self-generating country? Are we going to need to import that hydrogen? Where's that hydrogen going to come from? And how do we deploy that hydrogen from our importing ports? It's a really big, and I think there's been a lot of focus on the production side of things. There's been a lot of focus on the end use side of things. I think there's been little and not enough focus on the distribution and scaling up of how we store and distribute hydrogen.
We have another question. There is a view that the new technology on zero carbon should be cost neutral. Is that true? How do you make the case for what might be an early higher costs, I should say?
I think there's no doubt that all new technology is usually more expensive. I think the cost of not doing anything to not decarbonise isn't an option anymore. So I think we do need to come up with suitable solutions that are commercially viable, that allow for that payback. And I think the technology and what we're seeing in the cost reduction of hydrogen over time can see some significant commercial benefits as well. So I think we've got to look at there was a good comment yesterday on one of the payback over the next 15 to 20 year period and what that looks like and how that we're seeing with the cost of red diesel and you now using white diesel, the tripling of cost, and how these cost models can eventually be cost neutral.
We're going to have to leave it there. So thank you so much for your questions, your participation, but thank you for coming along today. Really fascinating to hear from you. Everybody, that was Paul Aspinall from Arcadis. Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much.